So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Donald Lopez, the Arthur E. Link Distinguished Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan. Those of you who were here at the first lecture last night heard about his many scholarly accomplishments, his numerous publications. What often gets left out in these introductions is any sense of the person as well as the scholar. Like the creation of a scientific Buddha from the Indian sage Shakyamuni, about which we will hear in a moment, the description of Donald Lopez as one of the greatest scholars of Buddhism is only part of the whole picture. I first came to know Don in 1992 in circumstances where his scholarship was of little aid, but his wonderful gentleness, kindness, and compassion meant everything. I was not exactly in my hockey mom phase when we met, since I was probably the only Canadian mom in history to have raised two boys who never played hockey. I suspect it is because I don't wear lipstick. But I was in Taiwan as a spouse and full-time mom, accompanying my Buddhologist husband, Koichi Shinohara, who was attending a conference on Buddhist monastic law. Don was also a participant at the conference. I had two small boys in tow, one of whom, with his unfailing instincts for the very best people, took an immediate liking to Don and insisted on sitting in the back of the bus with him on our trip from Taipei out into the countryside to visit a Buddhist temple. It would all have been fine, except that Mark got very sick all over his newfound friend. Throughout history, Buddhism has meant different things to different people, as we learned in Don's first lecture. But to me, that day, Don exemplified all the best of a Buddhist's virtues: compassion, loving kindness, patience, and a saintly indifference to things that would normally excite disgust. This is one view of Buddhism and one Buddhist, maybe even despite himself, I've never asked, that I have never been willing to jettison. But now I turn you over to Don to let him tell us about other views of Buddhism and the Buddha in his second lecture, Building a Better Buddha.
Thank you. You will infer that I'll be watching the debates with Professor Granoff tonight. So. Where was the scientific Buddha born? In this lecture, I will begin with the story of the European encounter with the Buddha, and then go on to consider some elements of the Buddha's person that are not often mentioned in popular portrayals. My purpose is not to describe an original Buddha and then a European deviation from it, nor is it to suggest that there is a Western Buddha and an Eastern Buddha who are utterly unrelated. The situation is more complicated, and I hope you will feel, after 45 minutes, more interesting than that. European references to the Buddha go back to Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century CE. In describing the Indian Gymnosophist, Clement writes, "Some of the Indians obey the precepts of Bauta, whom, on account of his extraordinary sanctity, they have raised to divine honors." After Clement, not much is heard about the Buddha in Greek or Latin until the 8th century, when in the works of St. John of Damascus, we find the story of Barlaam and Josaphat, clearly drawn from the life of the Buddha. References to the Buddha only began to appear again in European languages in the 13th century. Returning to Venice after 17 years in the service of the great Khan, Marco Polo's ship made port in the island of Sri Lanka, probably in 1292, and he writes, "Furthermore, you must know that in the island of Ceylon, there is an exceeding high mountain. It rises up so steep and precipitous that no one could ascend it. were it not that they have taken and fixed to it several great chains, iron and massive, so disposed that by help of these men are able to mount to the top. And I tell you, they say that on this mountain is the sepulchre of Adam, our first parent. At least that is what the Saracens say. But the idolaters say it is the sepulchre of Sagamoni Borkan, before whose time there were no idols. They hold him to have been the best of men, a great saint in fact, according to their fashion, and the first in whose name idols were made. On January 29, 1552, Francis Xavier, just back from Japan, wrote a letter from Kochi on the southwest coast of India back to his fellow priests in Europe, describing how the Japanese say prayers using a rosary. While they are reciting them, they continuously repeat at each bead the name of the founder of their sect. Some are devoted to frequently reciting their beads, but others less so. All of these sects, as I've said before, have two main founders, namely Zaka, X-A-C-A, and Amida. I tried to learn if those two, Amida and Zaka, had been men dedicated to philosophy. I asked the Christians to make an accurate translation of their lives. I discovered from what was written in their books that they were not men, since it was written that they lived for 1,000 and 2,000 years, and that Zaka will be born 8,000 times, and many other absurdities. These were not men, but pure inventions of the demons. Until long into the 19th century, European writers divided the peoples of the world into four nations in the old sense of that term: Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and idolaters. What we think of today as Buddhists were described by this last term, a word that we regard today, still feeling the power of St. Thomas Aquinas, as a term of abuse. And in some sense, what we think of today as the academic study of religion has over the past 2 centuries been devoted to the process of separating out various groups of these idolaters and giving them their own religions, each ending in ism: Hinduism, Sikhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Shintoism, Buddhism. Thus, Marco Polo, like the travelers who preceded and followed him, never identified the religion he encountered with the name Buddhism, or some rough Chinese or Mongol equivalent, or its priests as Buddhists. Instead, he referred to the monks he encountered at the court of Kublai Khan and in his travels through Asia simply as idolaters, and the statues that they worshipped as idols. From our perspective, it's clear that the statues that those intrepid travelers described are not idols, and that what they term idols are not statues of different gods, but of a single man, the historical figure and founder of a great religion, whom we know simply as the Buddha. But how could they have known that? Each of the Buddhist cultures of Asia developed its own artistic conventions for representing the Buddha. Not all images of the Buddha look alike, and in the centuries before photography, it was necessary to rely on artist renderings not always made in situ, but based on written accounts. Thus, for most of the long history of European contact with Buddhism, the Buddha was an idol, and he was known by many names. These names are, in fact, various garbled versions of his epithet Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan, hence Zaka, or his family name Gautama, so we find references to Godom, his title Buddha, and the Chinese name for Buddha, Fo. The Chinese character pronounced in the 18th century as Fo was in the Tang dynasty pronounced Bud. But none of this was known with what we would regard as historical accuracy until the early 19th century. And the identification of these various names with a single god only became widely known in the early 18th century, and only then with a strange detour through Africa. Up until the middle of the 18th century and beyond, the focus was not on the man or his teachings, but on the statue, and as we shall see, on the hair. Roman Catholic missionaries began to collect stories about the idols that they encountered. The Portuguese Jesuit Álvaro Samedo spent 22 years in China. His account of China was published in Madrid in 1642 in Portuguese. The passage I'll read today is from the 1655 English translation. The third sect is of the Pagods from India, from the part of Indostan, which sect they call Zaka, from the author of it, concerning whom they fable, he was conceived by his mother Maya upon the sight of a white elephant, which she saw in her sleep, and for the more purity she brought forth at one of her flanks, and then presently died, being but 19 years of age. And that, considering the death of his mother, the cause whereof he was by his birth, he resolved to leave the world and to do penance, the which he did in a mountain called the Snowy Mountain, where he had 4 masters with whom he studied 12 years, so that by the time he was 30 years of age, he was accomplished in the science of the first principle. He took the name of Zekia, or Zaka. He taught the doctrine for the space of 49 years. He had many scholars who, after his death, collected his papers and spread his doctrine through the greater part of Asia. Several decades later, a missionary to Sri Lanka speculated on the referent of the many names of the gods that the priests had encountered in Asia. So in 1688, the Portuguese Jesuit Fernão de Queiroz published The Temporal and Spiritual Conquest of Ceylon, which contained the most detailed life of the Buddha, referred to as Fo, the Chinese term, yet to appear in a European language. It had been compiled from Chinese sources by the great Jesuit scholar Tomás Pereira, advisor to the Kangxi Emperor. And at the end of his account, Queiroz writes, "And it has been observed that the Ganizis of Ceylon, the Talpois of Arakan, Pegu, Siam, and other neighboring realms, as well as the Lamazis of Tartary, agree with the Bonzes of China and Japan in the essentials of their sect and profession. It is easy to understand that the Buddhism of Ceylon, the Fo of China, the Zaka of Japan, is the same as the Zekia of India, for the word Buddhism is only an adapted name, and in Ceylon it means saint. If intelligent Europeans wonder, considering what it is that such intelligent people embrace as true, let them remember that heathen Europe so pertinaciously believed and worshipped. The fact is that the devil has forestalled everything, and by forestalled he means anticipated. When we preach to the heathens of hither India, they reply that they also have a trinity, and that their Vishnu incarnated himself times out of number. And if we preach to those of farther India and of Ceylon, for this sect has disappeared from many parts of India wherein it began, they reply that their Buddhism or their Fo or their Zaka also took the shape of a man, though he was an eternal being." For a more sustained engagement with the question of the identity of this God, we must turn to a Dutch scholar, or at least a Westphalian physician in the employ of the Dutch East India Company. This is Engelbert Camphor, who sailed from Batavia, which is the old name for Jakarta, which was the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, in 1690, stopping first in Siam before proceeding to Japan, where he would spend the next 2 years. Having seen statues of the local idol in both Thailand and Japan, he offered the following account of their origin. The Siamites represent the first teacher of their paganism in their temples in the figure of a Negro sitting, of a prodigious size, his hair curled, the skin black, but as it were out of respect, gilt over, accompanied on each side by one of his chief companions, as also before and around him by the rest of his apostles and disciples, all of the same color and most in the same posture. They believe, according to the Brahmins, that the deity dwelt in him, which he proved by his doctrine, way of life, and revelation. The Sinhalese call him Buddhism, the Chinese and Japanese Saka or Siaka, or plainly Photoge, that is, the idol, and with an honorable epithet, Sitsun, the great saint. About his origin and native country, I find the account of those heathens do not agree, but the Siamites and other nations lying further east have whole books full of the birth, life, and miracles of this god, Pra or Siaka. I'm at a loss how to reconcile these various and opposite accounts, which I've gathered in the above said countries, unless by supposing what I really think to be the true opinion, that the Siamites and other nations lying more easterly have confounded a younger teacher with Buddha and mistaken the former for the latter. which confusion of the gods and their names is very frequent in the histories of the Greeks and Egyptians, so that Pra or Siaka is not the same with Buddha, much less with Ram or Rama, as he is called by Father Kircher in his Sine Illustrata. The latter having appeared many 100,000 years before, but that he was some new impostor who set up but about 500 years before Christ's nativity. Besides this, many circumstances make it probable that Pra or Siaka was no Asiatic or Indian, but some Egyptian, an Egyptian priest of note, probably from Memphis, and a Moor, who with his brethren being expelled from their native country, brought the Egyptian religion into the Indies and propagated it there. Camphor correctly identifies the various statues as representations of the same figure, but he cannot extract consistent information from his informants on either the place or the date of his birth. He thus offers two hypotheses that would hold sway for the next century. We might refer to them as the two Buddha theory and the African hypothesis. These are often ascribed to Sir William Jones, who presented them to the Royal Asiatic Society of Calcutta in 1786 and 1788. But they originate with Camphor, who derived the African hypothesis not from texts he read, but from the statues he saw, and what he and many others would see as their, in their term, crisped hair. As late as 1825, the illustrious French sinologist Jean-Pierre Abel Remusat felt it necessary to publish an article entitled, quote, on some descriptive epithets of the Buddha, showing that Buddha did not belong to the black race, where he disputed the hypothesis of Jones that the Buddha was in fact an African. Let me inflict just one final quotation, this time from 1844, translated from the French. It is into the milieu of a society so constituted that was born, in a family of Kshatriyas, that of the Shakyas of Kapilavastu, who claimed descent from the ancient solar race of India, a young prince who, renouncing the world at the age of 29, became a monk under the name of Shakyamuni, or also Shramana Gautama. His doctrine, which according to the sutras was more moral than metaphysical, at least in its principle, rested upon an opinion accepted as a fact and upon a hope presented as a certitude. This opinion is that the visible world is in perpetual change, that death succeeds life and life death, that man, like all that surrounds him, revolves in the eternal circle of transmigration, that he successively passes through all forms of life, from the most elementary to the most perfect, that the place he occupies on the vast scale of living beings depends upon the merit of the actions he performs in this world, and thus the virtuous man must, after this life, be reborn with a divine body, and the guilty with the body of the damned, that the rewards of heaven and the punishments of hell have only a limited duration, like everything in the world, that time exhausts the merit of virtuous actions as it effaces the faults of evil actions, and that the fatal law of change brings the God as well as the damned back to earth in order to again put both to the test and make them pass through a series of transformations. The hope that Shakyamuni brought to humanity was the possibility to escape from the law of transmigration, entering what he calls nirvana, that is to say, annihilation. The definitive sign of annihilation was death, but a precursory sign in this life announced the man predestined for the supreme liberation. It was the possession of an unlimited science, which gave him a clear view of the world as it is, that is to say, the knowledge of physical and moral laws, and in a word, it was the practice of 6 transcendent perfections, that of almsgiving, morality, science, energy, patience, and charity. The authority upon which the monk of the Shakya race supported his teaching was entirely personal. It was formed of 2 elements, one real, the other ideal. The first was the consistency and the saintliness of his conduct, of which chastity, patience, and charity formed the principal features. The second was the claim he made to be Buddha, that is to say, enlightened, and as such to possess superhuman science and power. With his power, he performed miracles. With his science, he perceived in a form clear and complete the past and the future. Thereby, he could recount everything that each person had done in their previous existences, and so he asserted that an infinite number of beings had long ago attained, like him, through the practice of those same virtues, the dignity of Buddha before entering into complete annihilation. In the end, he presented himself to humanity as its savior, and he promised them that his death would not annihilate his doctrine, but that this doctrine would endure for a great number of centuries after him, and that when his salutary actions ceased, there would come into the world a new Buddha, whom he announced by name, and whom, before descending to earth, the legends say, he himself had crowned in heaven with the title Future Buddha. Perhaps unusual in its eloquence, this description seems conventional in its content. This is the Buddha that we know. It's important to recall, however, that the Buddha had never previously been described in quite these terms by a European or by an Asian for that matter. This is the Buddha of Eugène Burnouf, holder of the chair in Sanskrit at the Collège de France. The passage is from the ur-text of the academic study of Buddhism, Burnouf's 647-page magnum opus, published in 1844 with the understated title, Introduction to the History of Indian Buddhism. Our image of the Buddha, of the simple teacher of morality, seated beneath a tree, derives above all from this book. How Burnouf created this Buddha is a story for another time. We can say in brief that Burnouf could read Sanskrit, that he was the son of the French Enlightenment, and that he hated the Jesuits. What we have then is a familiar and perhaps fitting tale. European travelers, first mostly missionaries, merchants, and diplomats, later colonial officials, encountered Buddhism across Asia, but they could not read Buddhist texts, and hence they harbored many misconceptions about their religion and its founder. Eventually, with the rise of the science of philology and of Oriental scholarship in the 19th century, the huge corpus of Buddhist texts began to be read, providing a wealth of new information. The myriad idols coalesced into a single figure, who then became a historical figure, a founder of a great religion, and a superstition became a philosophy. This is what used to be described unequivocally as progress. One might reasonably ask at this point what all this has to do with science. The answer, in brief, is this. In order for the compatibility of Buddhism and science to be proclaimed, there had to be a scientific Buddha. That Buddha could not have come into existence without the science of philology. There had to be a science of Buddhism before there could be a scientific Buddha. And the science of Buddhism, and hence the fate of the scientific Buddha, arose in large part from a particular historical absence. The European travelers of the 17th and 18th centuries encountered what we would call Buddhism all over Asia, but not in India. The Buddha had lived in northern India in the 5th century BCE. Monks carried texts and images to much of Asia over the next millennium and a half. But by the 14th century, and before the arrival of the Portuguese, Buddhism had all but disappeared from India. The reasons for its disappearance were complex. The invasion of northern India by Muslim armies, one of many causes. But its consequences were profound. For by the time that European scholars, notably those of the British East India Company, trained in South Asian languages, began a sustained study of the culture and history of India, what they would come to call Buddhism was an artifact. There were no Buddhists in India, although there were Buddhists almost everywhere else in Asia. Instead, India had monuments, often in ruins, cave temples overgrown by jungle, and statues often broken. There were stone inscriptions to be deciphered, and there were Sanskrit manuscripts preserved in Nepal to the north, and Pali manuscripts in Sri Lanka to the south. These were the materials from which European philologists would build their Buddha. This Buddha and his Buddhism would be built largely from texts. Because there were no Buddhists living in India during the colonial period, Buddhism, and especially what would come to be called original or primitive Buddhism, became the domain of European and later Japanese scholars. They would create a Buddha and a Buddhism unknown in Asia and that may never have existed there before the late 19th century. What they believed they had found, however, was the historical Buddha. And this is all quite clear in the first academic lecture on Buddhism to be delivered in the United States. It was presented by Edward Eldridge Salisbury, instructor of Sanskrit at Yale, recently returned from study with Burnouf in Paris at the first annual meeting of the American Oriental Society on May 28, 1844. Addressing the question of the historicity of the Buddha, Salisbury enumerated 2 points. One, that a plausible foundation of real individuality is discoverable in even the wildest fables which the veneration for the Buddha has invented, and that the most extravagant have originated out of India, while nearly all agree in making India his native land. And 2, that the images of the Buddha are not monstrous, but seem to portray real humanity, while those of the old Hindu deities are absurdly inhuman. Given our setting, let me offer just a brief aside about Salisbury, one of a host of fascinating philologists of the 19th century. He was the son of a Congregationalist minister. After graduating from Yale in 1832, he set out with his new bride for Europe, where he studied Arabic and Sanskrit in Oxford, Berlin, and Paris. He returned then to Yale, where he offered, without salary, the first courses in Sanskrit in the United States. His lack of compensation may have been justified in part by the fact that over 12 years he had only 2 students. But one of these was W.D. Whitney, who would become a great Sanskritist. So when Salisbury had taught Whitney everything that he knew, Salisbury resigned his professorship, arranged for it to be offered to Whitney, and then provided his own funds to endow the chair. This is, of course, the fantasy of every graduate student. And this one time it came true. Salisbury's Buddha was the human and humane Buddha that his teacher Burnouf had described, a Buddha who has remained largely unchanged in the European imagination, or at least the scholarly imagination, since then. It was also a Buddha who came to be adopted by Buddhist elites in Sri Lanka, Japan, and China, who were desperately seeking to demonstrate, either to Christian missionaries or their own governments, that Buddhism was not superstition. The 19th century thus saw the birth of what the Jesuit historian Henri de Lubac has called the scientific discovery of Buddhism, that is, the study of Buddhism by scholars who could read Buddhist texts in the original. This was made possible by significant advances in the science of philology, with the discovery of language families and ancient connections between the classical Indian language of Sanskrit and the classical European languages of Greek and Latin, as well as modern German, French, and English. These were the so-called Indo-European or Aryan languages, Aryan, of course, being the Sanskrit term meaning noble or superior. Through a complicated process, the theories of language groups gave rise to theories of racial groups, and the kinship between the people of ancient India and the peoples of ancient Greece, and hence, through a certain leap of faith, those of modern Europe, was not simply a matter of verb roots, but of bloodlines. From this perspective, the Buddha was not so foreign. He was, in fact, racially an Aryan. But the nobility of the prince who had renounced his kingdom was not only hereditary. The Buddha had famously rejected the idea of inherited nobility, claiming that nobility derived instead from wisdom. He thus called his first teaching the Four Truths for the Noble, rather than the Four Noble Truths as the phrase is often translated. The Buddha thus became doubly noble. He was noble by birth, by blood, and by language. Yet he was also noble because he renounced his royal birth to achieve a spiritual nobility. In a Europe obsessed with questions of race and questions of humanity, the Buddha was both racially superior and a savior to all humanity, an ancient kinsman, a modern hero. This was a Buddha to whom all manner of scientific insights could be ascribed, from the mechanisms of the universe to the structure of the atom, from a natural law of morality to the deepest workings of the mind. To what extent is such a portrayal at odds with what we might term more traditional descriptions of the Buddha? Texts that we would classify as biographies of the Buddha did not begin to appear until several centuries after his death. The first of the Pali commentaries on a biography from the tradition that Victorian scholars thought most closely represented original Buddhism dates from the 5th century, almost a full millennium after the Buddha's passage into nirvana. Buddhist texts are generally less interested in the events of the Buddha's life and more interested in his particular qualities, like the qualities of his body, his speech, and his mind. His body is adorned with 32 marks of a Superman, including 40 perfect teeth, a tongue long enough to lick behind the ears, arms long enough to rub his knees without bending over, a protrusion on the top of his head over which the gods may not fly. Many texts report that the Buddha smiled on occasion, but it seemed to be a tight-lipped smile, the subtle and often enigmatic smile we see in so many statues and paintings. It's noteworthy that we rarely see the Buddha grin, that is, smile in such a way that one could see his perfect teeth, 40 teeth, teeth that are even with no gaps between them, very white. There's an important reason for this. When the Buddha smiles, multicolored rays of light radiate from his mouth and spread to the farthest reaches of the universe. They descend to cool the hot hells and to warm the cold hells. They ascend to the highest heavens, where the light is transformed into the sound of inspiring stanzas for the gods. The rays of light then return and disappear into the Buddha's body. The precise place at which they disappear is significant. If the Buddha wishes to explain a past action, the rays disappear into his back. If he wishes to predict the future, the rays disappear into his chest. If he wishes to predict a birth in hell, they disappear under the soles of his feet. If it's the birth among animals, they disappear into his heel. If it's a birth among humans, the rays disappear into his knee. Birth among gods, they disappear into his navel. And if he wishes to predict that someone will achieve Buddhahood, the rays of light disappear into the protrusion that crowns his head. What of the Buddha's speech? The Buddha's speech is endowed with 64 qualities of euphony, and it is said that if 1,000 people simultaneously ask a Buddha a question in 1,000 different languages, the Buddha hears each of those questions and understands it and replies to each by simply uttering the sound that is the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet. And each person in the audience hears an answer in their own language appropriate to them. And what are the qualities of the Buddha's mind? He has complete recollection of the past, including each of his own past lives, as well as the lives of all sentient beings. And the past lives of each being are said to be infinite in number. He has full knowledge of the present in the sense that he is aware, or has the capacity to be aware, of all events occurring in all realms of the multiple universes. He has full knowledge of everything that will occur in the future and is able to predict the precise circumstances under which various persons will become Buddhas. He has direct and complete insight into the most profound nature of reality at all times, such that he does not need to enter into meditation in order to see reality directly. He's fully aware of the content of the minds of all beings in the universe, and thus is able to teach them in accordance with their individual needs and dispositions. He's perfectly enlightened and hence omniscient. Although he passed into nirvana at the age of 81, he could have lived for an aeon or until the end of the aeon if he'd only been asked to do so. The Buddha described in the sutras, then, is more a figure of science fiction than of science. Scholars have long held that the Buddhas who preceded Shakyamuni, typically counted as 3 or 6 or 24, were not historical figures. Each is separated from his predecessor by billions of years. Instead, it is argued that the previous Buddhas were introduced into the early tradition to counter charges that the Buddha was guilty of the crime of innovation. The Buddha's opponents in the Brahmanical traditions of ancient India claim that their sacred texts, the Vedas, were eternal. They were never composed, but had always existed, only having been heard by ancient sages. The existence of the previous Buddhas allowed the Buddhists to make a similar claim. And before our world system came into existence, there were previous worlds with their own Buddhas without beginning. And each of these Buddhas taught the same truth, the same path to liberation from suffering. It is the continuity with the Buddhas of the past, rather than his unique insight, that provided the foundation for the Buddha's authority. Indeed, all Buddhas are said to be remarkably similar. in word and in deed. They differ from each other in just a few ways, one of which is the circumference of their aura. The common portrayal of the Buddha in the literature of Buddhism and Science is very different. Here, the Buddha is seen as a scientist, experimenting in the laboratory of the spirit, trying first a life of indulgence and then the life of asceticism, testing the various meditative techniques of the day before sitting down under the tree on that full moon night and discovering the truth for himself. The story is sometimes told in this way, and perhaps this is what occurred at that unrecoverable moment, subject to such endless commentary. But whether he was the 1,000th or the 4th or the first to see that truth, once it was seen, there was no further truth to be discovered over the past 2.5 millennia. To search for the truth in Buddhism is to follow the path that the Buddha revealed to the world. There is no other path. In this sense, Buddhism is profoundly conservative, constantly decrying innovation as deviation. Innovation, of course, has occurred in myriad ways over the course of the tradition, but that innovation must always be portrayed as elaboration, as yet another articulation of the Buddha's silent enlightenment. Yet, there is a certain parallel between the Buddha of the tradition and the Buddha of science. The Buddha of the tradition is validated by being the last, or more accurately, the most recent in a long line of enlightened beings who have discovered and taught the same truth. The Buddha of science is validated not by being at the end, but at the beginning, as the perfected person who first discovered the truths that lesser men would only learn millennia later. For the Buddha of the tradition to be valid, he must have understood what others had known long before him. For the Buddha of science to be valid, he must have understood what others did not know and would not know until long after him. Each of these visions is profoundly retrospective. Each evinces a deep longing for the primordial. The authority of the Buddha of the tradition derived from the fact that he simply rediscovered eternal truths that the prehistoric Buddhists had also found. Much of the early literature recounts their lives in more detail than they do his. And the disciples of the Buddha of science derive deep comfort from the thought that the most modern discoveries, indeed truths yet undiscovered, were known by the ancient Buddha so long ago. In closing, we might speculate as to what the Buddha of the tradition might say about the Buddha of science. And so I want to quote a passage from the Great Discourse on the Lion's Roar. This is a famous text from the Pali Canon, that oldest collection of texts, which according to many best represents the teachings of the Buddha himself. And here the Buddha declares, "Should someone say of me, the recluse Gautama does not have any superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. The recluse Gautama teaches a dharma merely hammered out by reasoning, following his own line of inquiry as it occurs to him. Unless he abandons that assertion and that state of mind and relinquishes that view, then, as surely if he had been carried off and put there, that person will wind up in hell." Thank you. I wanted to say just before we begin the question session, just to sort of say where we are in this series of lectures. For those of you who were kind enough to attend the first two, you have seen that the first two lectures have been both historical and retrospective, explaining where, when, and how the claims for the compatibility of Buddhism and science came to be made. The next two lectures, which will be Monday and Tuesday next week, I believe here at the same time in this room, will be prospective and will be constructive in the theological sense of the term constructive. The first, on Monday, will look at the doctrine of karma, which I think really represents Buddhist science, or the Buddhist theory of everything. And here I will look at the ways in which karma comes into conflict with the theory of evolution. And I will be arguing that the Buddha offers what amounts to a radical critique of natural selection. And then the final lecture will focus mostly on meditation, looking at not so much at what Buddhism tells us about the mind as what neuroscience might tell us about Buddhist meditation and about Buddhism in general. And that lecture will conclude with some thoughts on the Buddha as what's called Lokottara in Sanskrit, beyond the world. The Buddha as a teacher who seeks to overturn what is accepted as worldly truth, including scientific truth. So just to give you some idea of where we'll be heading next week. Thanks.
If you have a question you'd like to ask, please come to one of the two microphones. Then I'll start.
Okay. You have to go to the microphone.
Contrast between a belief that something's scientific and a belief in the superhuman qualities of the Buddha. And I want to ask you why you think those two are incompatible. Why isn't it possible to believe in the superhuman qualities of the Buddha and also believe that what he taught was scientific? And the reason why I'm saying that is that I mentioned it last night and I stick by it. I think the tradition at times speaks as if it wants to present itself as scientific and rational. So for example, in the Divyavadana, there'll be a passage about somebody asking at a local temple, a Yaksha temple, for a child. And then they get a child. But the Divyavadana then says, everybody knows this is nonsense. That's not how you get children. You don't get children from asking gods. You get children when the woman is in her fertile cycle and so on. And so they know exactly where children come from. And they want to present themselves as better than the local superstitions. The Jains do the same. Mm-hmm. They believe Mahavira is this superhuman creature, but then they'll write a text which is a polemical text against Hindu myths. And they'll say, we know, of course, that this is nonsense, that gods don't have sex with humans, and that isn't how children, and so on and so forth. So for these two traditions, the belief in the superhuman qualities, including superhuman physical attributes, does not seem to be incompatible with.
Well, but then when the Buddha has his debate, his famous debate at Shravasti, he doesn't debate with them on scientific terms. He rises up into the air and shoots fire out of the top of his body and water out of the bottom. And so there are miracle contests that occur a lot. And so I think the fact that those occur in polemical situations is in fact telling, and they know some things that these superstitious opponents and competitors for alms do not know, but that doesn't mean that the Buddha doesn't have all of these fantastic powers. And as I pointed out from the Sinhanada Sutta, if you say that he doesn't, you're headed straight for hell. And so I think it's really a question of what we mean by supernatural. And if we want to then put karma and rebirth in the supernatural category, then I think there really is a big difference between the scientific and the traditional Buddha. We can talk about it later.
Seems to me that karma and rebirth are not in the same category as water coming from the bottom and fire from the top, because karma and rebirth are in a different sphere, right? They're in a different domain.
You mean the domain of the unseen?
Well, yeah, domain of reality. And it seems, I'm wondering if one way of looking at this is to look at Buddhism sort of as one form of Buddhism, sort of folk Buddhism more or less, is where a certain superficial idea of Buddhism is then, infinitely elaborated, but within that superficial range, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas the kind of Buddhism that the Dalai Lama, et cetera, would be identified with would have no real interest in that sort of elaboration, but instead would be interested in essentially exploring the infinite depths of reality through first-person inquiry. So I wonder if that would be a good way of...
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, in terms of we can talk about the 32 marks of the Buddha, these fantastic things that occur, the webbed fingers and the crown protrusion and the urna between his eyes. Nagarjuna, who we regard as one of the great rationalists of Buddhist philosophy, wrote a text called the Ratnavali, in which he explains what the Buddha did in each of his past lives to have those 32 marks on his body now. So I think it's important to see, for us to try to understand the ways in which a single Buddhist figure, whether it's the Buddha, the Dalai Lama, Nagarjuna, or any other great monk or scholar, lives in a complete world which does not make this distinction between folk and philosophy. So I think one way to illustrate this is to look at the collected works of any great Tibetan Lama. And there you will see works on Madhyamaka philosophy. You'll find very arcane works on Buddhist logic. You'll see a text on how to make magical pills. You'll see works on how to make it rain. You'll see works on how to dispel demons. And so this is a complete universe in which the practice of Madhyamaka philosophy and work on choreography for an exorcism are not seen to be incompatible. And so I think that's really the challenge for us, to sort of see that as somehow holistic.
Could you talk a little bit more about that point, really, that the whole question of what of this stuff would be called rational or scientific or natural or philosophical, and what of this stuff would be called either religious or, if you don't like it, superstitious or supernatural or,
Called by whom? By us or by them?
By us.
Okay.
And some of the questions, what I mean is that your last answer, to me, made a lot of things clear, but maybe it's because I already work with that sort of thing, which is that when you go to another culture, which, whether it's the ancient Greeks or classical China or India, there's not a separation. When they talk about the world, or when they're making magical pills, or when they're trying to cure somebody, demons aren't in a different world from dust.
Sure.
So you talk about how that, the very problems of talking about the scientific Buddha, or the relationship between science and Buddha and Buddhism, is only given if you start off in a Western world in which religion and science are two separate things.
Right. So
I want you to explain that, how that works for the Buddha.
Okay, all right. Well, as I tried to sort of explain last night, the scientific Buddha arose out of a particular historical problem and out of a particular polemic in which a term of abuse, superstition, was being leveled at Buddhists, and they took then what was the weapon they were being hit over the head with, science, grabbed it and made it their own. And so, but in order to do that, as I've tried to suggest today, a huge side of who the Buddha has been understood to be over the course of millennia across Asia has to be completely bracketed. And he has to be made into this single historical figure, born in India, particular time. All of these things are certainly true on one level, but there are layers and layers and layers of meaning that have been given to him by the tradition that have to be kind of stripped away to leave this kind of man who in some ways I think is unrecognizable to the tradition. And so, the whole idea of the Buddha as knowing everything, of course, this has to be accepted. He's omniscient. He's the Buddha. That's what his name means. Yeah.
And it seems like there are two different ways to talk about this. One is the discovery that what this thing is, all these practices, is a religion called Buddhism, and it's not superstition. It's a religion. It's just it's just a hyper-Protestantism, perhaps. It's just really pure. That seems to be a different kind of apology that's going on than the scientific. But so it seems there have been two ways to appropriate Buddhism or to construct it. One is as a pure religion, and the other is sort of as a pure science. And are these two different things pursued by two different kinds of people, or in two different branches of scholarship?
I think they're pursued by the same people, and that it's a pure religion that is not incompatible with science. unlike all other religions, they would claim, this is the one that is fully compatible with science. And so, as we've talked about, some people are even reluctant to use the word religion to describe Buddhism, which I think is nonsense. But as we look at the development of the term world religion, as you know, the first two to be identified by that term were only Christianity and Buddhism. Islam and Judaism and Hinduism were all called local religions, so only Buddhism and Christianity had this sort of world spirit. I think this was in part because of race theory and anti-Semitism, that they were able to find this Aryan savior, this alternative Jesus in the form of the Buddha, and then basically ascribed to him all of these qualities of the Victorian age that somehow gave comfort to people who wanted to completely renounce the church and to renounce priestcraft and all those kinds of things, and to make him into this person that one could turn to as a religious figure without all of the things that people found so unseemly, including Judaism, frankly. So there's some things that are quite disquieting about this entire process in the 19th and early 20th century, clearly. But I see the identification of Buddhism as a world religion, the Buddha as this founder, as completely together with this idea that Buddhism is compatible with science. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the things that's being propounded by the proponents of scientific Buddhism is that the miraculous aspects or the miraculous capacities of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are somehow related to their transcendent wisdom, and to relate this in turn to, for instance, the miraculous capacity of, say, science as we know it today and scientific inventions in comparison to what would have been expected or even believed possible by 19th century European scientists. Mm-hmm. That is that somehow that there is this reason beyond reason that can actually become miraculous. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you think that this is somehow at work here, but I'm also somewhat troubled by this idea that in the time that Buddhist texts were being written and statues and the religious legends are being established, there's no culture in the world where supernatural, science is divorced from miraculous supernatural activities. And therefore, are you suggesting that Buddhism, that what is significant here is that if Buddhism were left to its own devices, to follow its own merry course, that scientific, without the interaction of, sort of European agency, that scientific Buddhism would have never developed?
Scientific Buddhism clearly developed as a result of the colonial encounter. I feel quite strongly about that. However, I don't have any problems with supernatural Buddhism. I like it a lot. And I feel that if that is somehow stripped away, there's not so much left. So I think it's important for us to look at the fact that the Buddha emerged from under his mother's right arm, took 7 steps, and said, I'm the best thing on 2 feet. I mean, if we have to give up that kind of thing, I think a lot is lost.
Yeah, I guess my question was a little roundabout there, but what I'm curious is, how does this relate to, what are you getting at in terms of, that something is lost there, but what if, I'm sorry, I'm not able to verbalize what the difficulty is.
Okay,
my apologies.
We can talk later, yeah.
My question is what your thoughts are about the development of Zen and what is kind of espoused as a rational type of Buddhism before the age of colonialism.
Zen as a rational form of Buddhism before the age of colonialism? Yeah. What do you have in mind? Yeah.
I mean, when one tends to read these Zen stories, there's an emphasis, at least from kind of the teachings that I've read, is of a historical Buddha and also kind of like the rational thought, the koans, and kind of away from the super mysticism that you've talked about.
Well, I think that most of the cosmology of Buddhism is all retained in Zen, and the koans are really supposed to be kind of super rational, right? They're supposed to destroy reason and destroy conceptions. So That's obviously a very important part of the tradition in East Asia. But if you look at the writings of Zen masters, both in China and Korea and Japan, the rebirth and all of these things that we've talked about are at the very foundation. So I think that one of the problems with Suzuki's work is that he wanted to somehow separate Zen out from Buddhism, and I think later scholarship has shown that that's not the case. You may know the great historian of religion Mircea Eliade wrote a book called From Primitives to Zen, as if there was an evolutionary cycle that began with the Australian Aborigines and ended with Zen Buddhism, and of course that's probably problematic. Yeah, Koichi.
I'm not sure that I believe what I'm trying to ask you about.
Okay.
But I see that your point, that scientific Buddhism is a very artificial construct. But I just wonder what the alternative is. So, okay, you get rid of scientific Buddha, and then you go back to the world of these traditional Buddhist scholars and writers who wrote about abstract philosophy and then demonology and so on. Now, we can't go back there, I think. And that the people, I mean, scientific is a little bit excessive, but you know, there are, like, the Japanese, I mean, they belong to the same category, Japanese philosophers who try to sort of write Dogen as a great philosopher, Kukai. I usually teach my courses debunking them, but that, if you think about it, I mean, they are trying to find something that teaches us something. And that, can we get that kind of inspirational approach to systematic Buddhism, which is not this modern scientific construct thing. I mean, if you get rid of that, then are we back into sort of aesthetic appreciation of the traditional world, but it doesn't really teach me anything about this world or how to live this world?
Yeah.
I mean, is that a dilemma? This seems to be a problem to me. But
well, your questions will be answered in lectures 3 and 4. But that's really, I am going to try to salvage something and to see something quite profound and meaningful in Buddhism that we can keep without just seeing, as you say, as some aesthetic of an ancient world. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, some of the things that seem to be mythic in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, as they come into the West, they're taught to a lot of us Westerners as simply skillful means. At least this is the way that Tibetans sometimes give it to us. Like, well, yes, there's not really this being floating around in space, but it's useful to relate with this figure. To what extent do you think this is an adaptation coming west, or to what extent do you think historically it has been thought of as a skillful means, which would make it a little more compatible with science?
The Tibetan philosopher Gindan Trimbel wrote an essay in 1938 explaining to his fellow Tibetans that the world is round. And in it he said that the Buddha did indeed teach that the world is flat, but the Buddha knew that the world was round. He taught that the world was flat because if he told people it was round, no one would believe him, and they wouldn't listen to the more important things that he had to say. So the idea of upaya in all of these things has a long tradition in the explanation of various things that seem contradictory. This is one of the great tools of Buddhism. I once was speaking to a Tibetan geshe in India who had never been to the West, and he was asking me about this globe and the world being round, and I was explaining to him that it really is round, and he wanted to say that, no, it's really flat, and I said, well, if that's the case, no one has ever found Mount Meru. It's a very, very tall mountain in the center of the universe, and it has not been seen from space. No one has discovered it, and he said to me, if you had pure karma, you could see it. So I had no answer to that. Yeah. Maybe that's a good point upon which to end. Okay. Yeah.